There were 4 of us when we broke into the Megaplex. There was Ralph, better known as Razorgore on YouTube, and Dale, better known as Drakesong. The 2 of them often do head-to-head videos on YouTube, as well as Let's Plays and other game content where they played the latest video games and titles. Jeremy, Kyle, and I were just the editing team, but we appeared on the channel often enough to be recognized. I was operating the camera that night as we came up to the back door of the Megaplex, ducking under the police tape. "What's up, Gorehounds? Tonight we have something special for you," Ralph said, trying to keep his voice pitched low and failing. "As some of you may know, the Megaplex in our area was recently closed under some pretty creepy circumstances." Ralph pulled a goofy-looking face that was probably supposed to be creepy as he looked into the camera. Dale tried to stay in the shot, looking unimpressed and striving for that too cool for this look. Kyle and Jeremy stood outside the camera, Jeremy waiting for his cue and Kyle looking around nervously. Ralph had talked us into this, and all of us were having second thoughts now that we were here. The payoff would be spectacular, but the risks would definitely be high. "For those of you who don't know," Dale said, "last week an unknown man came in for the midnight showing of Silence of the Lambs and killed 8 patrons in the theater. Many of the others escaped, but when the cops burst in, he was nowhere to be found. The theater has been closed for 2 weeks now, with no sign of the murderer, so we figured it's the perfect place to break into and play some Dead by Daylight, maybe some Friday the 13th, as we all sit in the creepy theater, isolated in the darkness." We kept saying break-in because it sounded more dramatic. In reality, Jeremy worked for the Megaplex as an assistant manager, and he had keys. I kept the camera on Ralph and Dale as Jeremy approached the employee entrance with the crowbar, so the camera could easily see him as he passed. After some grunting and exertion off-screen, while Ralph and Dale hyped up the stream, Jeremy slid the key into the lock and unlocked it with one quick, smooth twist. He gave a mighty strain and pretended to wrench the door open as he turned the handle. I turned to look at the door as it came flying open, and the 2 congratulated him as we proceeded into the dark back room of the Megaplex. I had all 4 of our laptops in a bag around my back, and I tried not to bump them together as we walked inside. I would sit in the booth and monitor the stream, collecting the video and audio from the other sessions, and piece them together into something cool that we could post on our channels next week. The creepy ambience and gameplay would play well together. It would ensure that we had something awesome for maximum viewership. I could also monitor them from the central projection hub in case something went wrong. The theater was dark, the emergency exit signs glaring garishly at us as we walked through the snack bar and into the common area. The Megaplex had 12 different theaters and would allow each of us to sit in a different one without even having to leave our fingerprints in the theater that was also a crime scene. We had toyed with the idea of having all of them sit in there, basking in the atmosphere of death as they played killers and victims. But the idea of accidentally leaving evidence behind to incriminate ourselves was particularly unappealing. We were already taking a huge risk by doing this. Mitigating risk from herein was important. "Okay, we're going to set up now," Ralph said to the camera as he stood near the entrance to the theater hallway. "See you on the other side, Gorehounds," he intoned. I switched off the camera and put down the bag as I handed out the controllers. "Okay, here's your controllers. Take any theater but 7. Jeremy, show me which one of these keys gets me in the booth again." Jeremy flipped through them until he found a longish silver one, handing it to me. "This one, and the one next to it'll get you into the projection cage. You know what you're doing up there, right?" he asked for the 1,000th time. "Hook the HDMI cables from the laptop to the projector. It's not rocket surgery, dude." "Please, for the love of God, don't unhook anything that's already hooked up to the projectors. We're playing a pretty dangerous game here already, and I don't want anyone questioning why there are suddenly wires unplugged." "I think I can handle it, Jeremy. Now you guys go and get set up so we can get started." They went towards the theater, and I went towards the projection booth. 30 minutes later, we were ready to start streaming. The software on each laptop was easy to set up, and hooking the computers to the projector was easy. Each of their audio feeds let me hear what they were saying, and let them communicate with each other through the game software. They had taken theaters 5, 6, 8, and 9, leaving theater 7 empty between them. I couldn't help but glance down into the dark theater as I worked, my eyes straying to it ever so often. The lurid red exit signs were the only light in theater 7, casting the police tape and seats in an eerie crimson glow. I cut the screens on for 5, 6, 8, and 9, seeing the theaters light up as the screens flickered to life. When the screen for 7 came on too, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced out the little window that gave me a bird's eye view of the theater, and nearly dropped the laptop I'd been about to move. From my vantage point, I had a great view of the large black shape standing frozen in front of the screen. I backed away shakily, startled by the sudden appearance of the gangly shape, and bumped into the desk as I stumbled away from the frightening sight. I stood, breathing hard, as my mind raced and my brain ran over 1,000 different scenarios. Was it the killer? A cop doing some late-night investigation? A janitor? They weren't moving, so I had probably startled them as bad as they'd startled me. What if it was the killer? They had said they'd never left, hadn't they? My mind kept plodding over that little nugget as I stood motionless and felt my guts writhing in terror. I needed to get the audio feeds hooked up so I could warn them. I needed to call their cell phones so they could run. I needed to do something other than just stand here in abject terror, but that seemed to be all I was capable of doing. When he continued to stand motionless, however, I felt my fear ebb some and took another look. I realized my mistake pretty quick. The coat had clearly been left over a chair or something. The longer I looked at it, the more details became apparent, and the stranger it became that I couldn't see the arms or legs sticking out of it. I laughed when I realized I was frozen in fear by someone's leftover coat, and chalked it up to the creepy ambience of this abandoned theater. I was too jumpy. I had to keep my head in the game. I got back to work. "Mic 1, check," I asked, sitting down and testing the setup. "Check," said Ralph. I saw a little light come on in the seating area as his controller came on. "Mic 2, check." "Check," said Dale. "Mic 3, check." Nothing. "Mic 3, check," I asked, looking out into Theater 8. I didn't see anyone sitting in the dark rows of seats and started glancing around to see where Jeremy was. The screen was a solid, staticky white that covered the whole theater in a bright carpet of light. By that light, I could see nothing but an empty theater. This inevitably led my eyes over to Theater 7, and I had to double-take when I noticed something was amiss. I stood up, squinting at the chair someone had left on the little platform in front of the screen. The chair was bare now, just a silhouette behind the white screen. The coat was gone. "Sorry, Mic 3 here. I had to go to the bathroom." The coat had been there. I knew I had seen it. The ragged old coat had been sitting on a chair in front of the screen, a chair that was now empty. The hood had been up, making me think that someone had been inside it, the arms dangling out like empty scarecrows, and now it was just gone. The theater was still empty. I could see it illuminated by the screen, but the coat had vanished. "Hey, are you there? Control, come back." I shook it off and went back to my setup. "Check. Mic 4, check." "Check and check," Kyle said. I got back to the job at hand. I'd ponder that old coat and its escape act later. I would ponder that old coat a lot more than that in the coming days. I lined up their cameras so their fans could see and hear them, and then we officially started the stream. Our last stream, as it happens. "What's up, Gorehounds? I'm joined by Drake Song from channel Dragonhorn, as well as Kyle and Jeremy, regulars on the show. We're going to be playing some Dead by Daylight in the bowels of the murder megaplex." His head was little more than a ghostly floating specter as the camera picked it up and made him look a little ghoulish in the dim light. The screen became black as the game started. I watched as they rolled into the selection menu, the game divvying up teams and assigning the killer. I let my mind wander a bit as I monitored the stream. The boys were enjoying themselves, yelling and screaming whenever the killer would sneak up on them. They had played 3 games, Jeremy taking the killer role twice, when someone in the comments started trying to get my attention. This was pretty typical behavior. Most of these guys were attention whores, and they wanted to make the highlight reel at the end of the video where we showed great comments or funny moments. This guy, despite the ridicule he was getting from the others in the comments section, was not letting up, and that drew my attention. "There's a shadow behind Kyle," he said. Then a few minutes later, "Seriously, someone is sneaking up behind Kyle." 5 seconds after that, he posted, "Someone get Kyle's attention. Someone is coming up behind him." I looked at the camera feed, but saw nothing besides Kyle's face lit by the ghostly light of the movie screen. The game was the kind that favored a very muted color palette, and it had bathed the theater in a murky tone. I looked back to chat and saw that the guy was still yelling about someone coming up behind Kyle, telling him to watch out. I looked back at the feed and nearly fell out of my chair as a momentary flash of lightning in the game lit up the whole theater. I had seen someone poised behind him for a bare second, a black-clad figure in a long, ratty coat that I remembered all too well. I keyed up Kyle's mic and told him to watch out, but he didn't move. Instead, he just continued to look at the screen with that same frozen look of concentration he had been wearing all night. Kyle had always had this intense look when he gamed, his expression somewhere between concentration and catatonia. I could see the silhouette of the man behind him, but it, too, was stationary and unmoving. When his feed cut out abruptly, I realized he'd been frozen for about 5 minutes. I looked out into the theater and could see Kyle still sitting there, head bent a little. His character was standing still. Ralph strolled by with the Reaper and killed him, dropping him with an easy swipe of his sickle. "Oh, tough break, Kyle. You hit a lag spike or something?" Kyle said nothing. I glanced out at the theater Ralph was in and saw that he was alone in the murky blackness. Ditto for Jeremy, and ditto for Dale. I assumed that the figure was still in the theater with Kyle, so maybe I had time to warn the others. It occurred to me that this might all be an elaborate prank, but surely they would have told me if it were, right? Otherwise, I might call the cops, which would draw attention to our stream and cause us to have to leave. I keyed up Ralph's mic so the others wouldn't hear me. "Ralph, we've got a problem." "What's up, homie?" Ralph asked, and I could hear the theater speakers booming in the background. "Something's going on. There's someone in the theater with Kyle, and now he won't respond. He hasn't moved his character, and I can't raise him on the headset. I think something's happened to him, but I need you to tell me if this is some kind of prank." Ralph was quiet for a second before chuckling kind of weirdly. "I don't have the slightest idea what you're talking about, homie, but if you're trying to run a prank here, it's not funny. It's creepy enough in this theater all by itself. I don't need to think about some creeper roaming around in the dark. Look, I'm telling you, this looks like..." But then I looked out into his theater and I felt my next words stolen from me. Someone was standing in the aisle a few feet from Ralph's seat. Someone who was holding a crowbar that was dripping wetly. "Ralph, behind you!" I yelled, but by the time he turned, it was too late. Ralph cringed against the seat in front of him as the hooded figure lunged with the upraised tool. I watched as his controller spilled to the floor, the assailant smashing him across the face with the dripping instrument. He rode him to the ground, Ralph looking dazed as he fell. The tool came up with each swing in a theatrical, horror movie fashion, sending out sprays of blood that coated the seats. The figure rose once he'd finished, and I could almost feel his eyes on me as he looked up to the projection booth. I backstepped to the computer and keyed up the other 2 mics. "Dale, Jeremy, you guys need to come to the projection booth right now." "Why?" Dale asked. Someone just killed Ralph." "What?" Jeremy asked, and I could hear him standing up. "He beat him to death with a crowbar. We need to get the hell out of here right now." "Agreed. Dale, you and I should head for the emergency exit in the theater while..." But there was a sound like someone tripping over carpet. I heard Jeremy's mic go dead, and a quick look showed me his feet being dragged behind a row of seats. I heard wind passing by Dale's mic as he ran for the exit. I could hear him hyperventilating a little, and as I watched, I could see him running for the glowing exit signs. I could also see the figure step out in front of him from a row of seats and bash him with the crowbar, knocking him sideways into the other row of seats. I backed away from the window then, starting to hyperventilate myself. This was crazy. How could they have gotten Dale and Jeremy at the same time? Was there more than one killer? How had they gotten this far? Had they been waiting for us this whole time? I shook myself out of my daze and decided that I needed to go. I looked at the equipment on the table and decided to leave it pretty quick. It would slow me down, and who really cared if the police found it? I was getting ready to report this the second I got outside anyway. I glanced through the projection hole one last time, checking to see if anyone was in the theater, and finding no one below. That was when something slammed into the projection room door, and I fell on my ass. I scuttled back against the wall, eyes glued to the door that was being violently rammed from the other side. Whatever it was slammed into the door a few more times before it rattled the handle and found it locked. I was suddenly glad I'd remembered to lock it, and I patted my pocket for my phone. I decided to go ahead and call the police. They could book me for trespassing right after they saved my life. It wasn't until I'd patted myself down a half a dozen times that I remembered I'd left it on the table next to the laptop. That was also when I realized that the banging had stopped. I crept on hands and knees towards the desk, praying the phone hadn't fallen. The silence was deafening in the wake of the explosive pounding. I kept glancing at the door as I crawled, expecting that any minute the door would burst open. I was afraid to look over the edge of the table, fumbling in vain as I tried to find my phone. That's when I heard a truly chilling noise, the last noise I ever expected to hear. The sound of keys being thrust into the lock, and the door being opened with a simple turn of the knob. I sat huddled beneath the table as a hooded figure wandered into the office. He was tall, his face hidden under the blackness of that dark covering, and his feet echoed off the floor as he stalked towards me. I tried to back up further. My back smashed the metal legs of the table as I came up short. I felt my legs tremble as I shook, and I closed my eyes as I expected to die very messily. I opened them again when I heard the laughter from the doorway as Ralph and Dale came through the door with their cameras in hand. "Oh man, we got you so good," Ralph laughed. "He bought it hook, line, and sinker," said Dale. "Another classic prank." I couldn't believe it. This had all been some stupid prank for their channel. I watched as the killer doubled over and started laughing too, his crowbar dropping with a plastic thunk to the ground. When the hood came down, I saw it was Titus, our sometimes roadie, when we took our shows on the road. Jeremy leaned in the doorway, laughing uproariously, as the others high-fived and congratulated themselves on scaring me half to death. I wanted to be mad, but I found myself laughing out of pure nervous relief. You jerks," I breathed, accepting Titus's offered hand. "You really scared the crap out of me." I slapped Titus on the shoulder. "How the hell did you get across 3 theaters in a matter of seconds anyway?" Titus looked confused at that. I didn't. I snuck into Ralph's theater through the fire door and waited for you to notice me. Then I ran out after you turned away, coming into Dale's theater and catching him as he tried to escape." "I pretended to drag myself behind the seats," Jeremy said. "And Kyle?" Titus was still laughing, but he looked a little confused. "What about him? We didn't even tell him about this prank. You know Kyle's a blabbermouth. He'd have never been able to pull this off." That made me pause for a minute. "Where is Kyle?" I asked, not seeing him and really being concerned about that for the first time. Ralph and Dale looked at each other. "Dunno. No way he's still in that theater." I looked down from the box, and sure enough, Kyle was still in the theater, unmoving and not playing the game. We tried to raise him through the mic again, to no avail, and after thumping on the glass window for a few minutes to get his attention, we decided to go see what was going on with him. The 5 of us came down the stairs and crept toward Kyle's theater. The door creaked ominously as Jeremy pushed it open, and I could see Kyle's head framed by the white screen as he sat upright, staring forward, and I moved inside to go see what was up with him. I came up behind him, pausing as I caught sight of something I hadn't seen before from my high vantage point. I didn't need to touch him to realize why he wasn't going to answer me, and they all drew close as I took a few balky steps back. There was a machete sticking through the back of the chair, pinning him to the seat. When the others saw him, they all started freaking out, talking all at once as we tried to figure out what to do next. Ralph wanted to call the police. Jeremy wanted to get the hell out of the theater and then call the police. Dale just wanted to be out of the theater. We all kept trying to talk over each other, our terror rising as we kept stepping on each other's conversation. That's why it took so long to realize that Titus was gone. We looked around for him, but no one could remember if he'd come into the theater with us. The last time anyone had seen him was in the projection booth. That seemed to be the deciding factor for Dale. He had his phone out, dialing 911 before anyone could say anything about it. Jeremy slapped it out of his hand, though, and the 2 of them stared at each other in surprise. Jeremy seemed as surprised by what he had done as Dale was to have his phone slapped away. It bounced under a nearby seat, and the 2 of them just stood silently for a few seconds before Dale asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. "I don't want to be involved with this. If you call the cops, I'm going to lose my job." "Screw your job," Dale yelled. "At least one person is dead." "Let's just leave first. We can get outside and then call them. You 2 can stay and say that this was your idea, and I can..." Dale was dropping to his hands and knees, looking for his phone under the seat. "Man, that's some cowardly shit. One of our friends is dead, and you're worried about losing your job. Man, I can't believe I ever..." His words were cut off, though, when someone drug him under the seat, and he started screaming. We scattered as Dale screamed, all 3 of us flying like quail, as we tried to put as much distance between ourselves and the killer as possible. I had my phone out as I left the theater, dialing the number for emergency services as I went. I vaulted the concession counter and hid behind it as the line buzzed and buzzed. I sat there shaking, the smell of old popcorn and aged soda in my nose as I waited for someone to pick up. 911, what is your emergency? I sighed, glad to hear someone outside of this place. I told them I was at the Megaplex and that I needed the police there immediately. I told them how we had used Jeremy's keys to get inside, how we were planning to set up a stream and play games in the creepy theater, how they had pulled a prank on me that had started all of this. I told her about Kyle and Titus and about all my friends who were probably being murdered right now that we had split up. and I told her once again that I needed help. I felt the tears roll down my face as I started to cry. She assured me that help was on the way, but that I needed to stay on the line. That was when someone kicked the counter from the other side, and I practically threw my phone in surprise. I could hear the lady on the other end calling my name, seeing if I was there, but my phone had landed against the opposite counter, and my attention was dominated by a hulking figure standing over me. The bar came up to his waist. The guy was nearly 7.5 feet tall and dressed in cast-off clothes and a long coat with a hood. He was holding the crowbar, his sightless face looking down at me, and then he smashed the crowbar against the glass, and I felt drops of something splatter across my face. I wiped them off and saw the red streaks on my fingers, realizing that his crowbar was splattered with blood. For a moment, we just stared at each other, his featureless face glowering at me. I couldn't see him glowering, but I could feel it as he glowered at me in disapproval. I had come into his den, his hunting ground, and now I was his prey. He turned, taking a step towards the opening that would let him behind the counter, and I weighed my escape options. I could try to vault the counter, but it seemed likely that he would catch me before I got to the door. If I sat right there, I'd get killed in short order, but if I sprinted for the area behind the concession stand, where the door was we'd come through, he might not be able to catch me in time. This seemed like my best course of action. He would likely still get me before I got to the door, but it was my only hope of escaping. The choice, however, was made for me. He had just stepped into the space between the counter and the back when the blue lights framed him up, and he looked at the big glass door in front of the building. He broke and ran for the back of the Megaplex then, back towards the theaters, back towards whatever nest he had made for himself back there. The cops found me behind the counter a few minutes later. A search of the Megaplex turned up the rest of my friends, or what was left of them at least. Each of them had been killed. They had been stabbed or bludgeoned or just strangled with the bare hands of that imposing shade. I was the only survivor, it seemed, and the police were very interested in getting my statement. That's why I'm here in this interrogation room, filling out this report. They haven't talked about criminal charges yet. I think they figure I've suffered enough. What they want is my complete report on the happenings of this evening. You can be certain that I'll never forget the events of tonight's stream. The last stream of my career, very likely. "Oh my God, there it is! Stop the car, Jacob!" Lily exclaimed as the house she saw in the ad came into view. Lily and Jacob had been in the same neighborhood for most of their 12-year marriage. They had liked the area when they moved in, but the peaceful neighborhood had seen its share of crime and decline lately. The straw that broke the camel's back and made them decide to move had been 3 nights ago when they'd been out to dinner. They'd been celebrating their 12-year anniversary when someone broke into their house and ransacked the place. Anything of value that wasn't locked in the safe was taken. When the police finally got there, they acted as though they couldn't care less. There was absolutely no help. So the next day, Lily went online to find a new house within their price range. Lo and behold, she found a lovely house a few neighborhoods over, on the nicer side of town. It was a closer commute to Jacob's work and was well within their price range. Lily wasted no time calling the number on the ad and setting up a walkthrough. They had set it up for that Saturday morning, but when Saturday arrived, Lily had gotten a short text telling her to go ahead and have a look at the place and sending her the code to the key box on the door. The owners said that they wouldn't be able to make it, but if they wanted to take a look, they could go right ahead, just to be sure to return the key when they were done and let them know what they thought. Jacob was very reluctant and wanted Lily to reschedule for a time when the owner could join them, but Lily wouldn't hear of it. She threatened to go herself, but that seemed to make up Jacob's mind, and he agreed to come with her. As they pulled into the driveway, Lily could hardly contain herself. She jumped out of the car and rushed to the porch, stretching her arms and taking a deep breath. The scent of gardenias filled her nose, the smell reminding her of summers she spent at her grandmother's house as a child. In fact, the front porch reminded her a little of her grandparents' house, too. The long porch stretched the whole front of the house, and it had several weather-worn rockers and a swing hanging from a pair of chains. Had her grandmother had a swing like that? Had Lily sat on it and swung when she was a little girl? Had she gone too high, perhaps? And Jacob leaned out the window, his hand over the phone. "Sweetheart, it's work. I gotta take this. I'll catch up with you as soon as I get done." Lily gave him a tart look and shrugged. She took one more deep breath before mounting the porch and approaching the front door. She had seen it on Zillow when she was looking for houses, and it had been one of the biggest reasons she wanted the place. It had 8 squares on the front. There was red, green, and green again, just like her grandparents' door. She could remember standing in front of the door as a little girl, feeling excited as she waited for it to open. Since her grandmother wasn't going to come to let her in this time, she put in the code and got the key to open the door. The door opened with a little creak, and Lily stepped inside with a broad grin. Jacob looked up at Lily as she walked into the house, thinking of how beautiful she looked as she walked past the threshold. He couldn't have known this, but it would be the last time he'd ever see her. As Lily stepped into the front hall of the house, she felt a bit of déjà vu. She felt like she was coming home, as if she'd been here 1,000 times before. On her right was a large archway that led into a sitting room. Lily decided to check out that room first, since it was the closest, and there was a window so she could look out and see if Jacob was coming in. As she walked into the room, she felt a strange change in the atmosphere, the whole thing beginning to shift. Lily walked to the window to call out to Jacob, but when she looked outside, his car was no longer in the driveway. Instead, there were several familiar-looking vehicles. Was that her parents' car from when she was 9? And that car looked like Aunt Judy's car. That truck parked on the street looked just like her grandparents'. But that was impossible. She'd watched her mom sell that car when she was 10. What was going on here? As she stood there confused, she heard a voice calling to her. Lily turned around, but she was no longer alone. Her family filled the couch and chairs. The room looked just like her grandma's sitting room from when she was a kid. She could remember seeing everyone seated like this once before, and the memory made her feel kind of crawly. As a child, they had often sat in her grandmother's sitting room during holidays or special occasions, but something was off today. Something wasn't quite how she remembered it. Everyone looked as though they had been crying. She didn't remember this scene from her childhood quite like this. Something was very wrong. As she abandoned her place next to the window, she walked as though in a haze to where her mother sat. She looked up as Lily approached and patted the couch next to her, motioning for her to sit. Her mother put an arm around her, not an altogether familiar feeling, and when Lily spoke, her voice was that of a very young child. "What's wrong, Mama?" Lily asked, looking around at everyone and seeing tears welling up in their eyes. Her father spoke first, though. "Lilybug, there's been an accident. Your grandmother fell down the basement stairs. She didn't make it." As those words left his mouth, everyone began to wail, and Lily felt her mother press her face against her head. Lily, however, sat speechless, trying to process what she'd heard. This wasn't how she remembered this, was it? Lily got up from her spot on the couch and began to pace. Her memory of that day was fuzzy, but as she walked between the couch and the window, it began to solidify. She remembered her family telling her that her grandma had gone to live in Boca, not that she was dead. When Lily turned back to confront her mother, though, she found that she was alone in the sitting room again. The furniture, her family, everything was gone. The room was as it was when she walked through the front door, and Lily shuddered as a palpable chill ran through her. "Looks like a goose walked over your grave," she heard her grandmother say, and it was as if she were just in the next room. Lily rushed to the front door to get out of the house, wanting nothing so much as to smell the gardenias again, before she jumped into the car and told Jacob to drive away. She should have listened to him. She should have waited, but she'd been so eager to see this place. It had brought back so many memories, so many times that made her feel young again. But that was gone now. She didn't care how dangerous their neighborhood was. She would gladly live there for the rest of time if it meant that she could leave this mausoleum. The door, however, was gone. The entryway was still there, but the wall where the front door should be was a blank. She ran back to the sitting room window and started pounding on it, trying to get Jacob's attention. His car was back, and he was sitting in the front seat, but he didn't seem to hear her. "Jacob, please, help me!" she screamed, but Jacob didn't answer. He glanced up, but then looked back down to the phone, talking with Terry or Mark or whoever it was calling him from work. He couldn't see her. He didn't know she was stuck. And suddenly Lily realized she was alone. If she was going to get out of here, she'd have to do it herself. Lily thought she might as well look for another way out, and as if summoned, she noticed the hallway that ran opposite the sitting room. There would be a bathroom down there, if she remembered right, and some cold water on her face sounded exactly like what she needed. She headed to the bathroom, but as she got closer, she felt that strange shivering again. As she came closer, she could hear the sound of sloshing water, as if someone was splashing frantically in the bathtub. Lily stepped cautiously to the door that separated the hall from the small bathroom, and peeked in as the wooden barrier made a funny squeaking sound. She could see her father, knelt down at the side of the tub, and she could see him holding her mother's head under the water. Lily stepped back, the door opening to give her a terrible view of her mother's drowning. But it all seemed wrong. That wasn't how she remembered that horrible time when she was 12. Was it? Lily remembered her father trying to help her mother out of the tub when she'd had a seizure. She remembered him trying, but not being able to save her. This new reality of what really happened hurt her brain more than her heart, and Lily tore off in a mad scramble to be away from the awful sound of her mother drowning again and again. Lily ran to the staircase that lay beyond the foyer and darted up the steps without thinking of where she was going. As she ran into one of the bedrooms, her mind still reeling from the scene below, the feeling of déjà vu came yet again. As she turned to take in the room that she had just run into, she could see a crib with a mobile twirling overhead. The smiling yellow ducks spun drunkenly, but even their placidity couldn't bring joy to the scene. This was her son's room. "No," she pleaded, "not this memory." Her husband walked into the room, holding their 3-week-old son to his chest. It should have brought her joy to see him again, till she realized her wonderful husband was holding little Jonathan's face to his chest, muffling the sound of his cries. He didn't seem to notice her watching him, didn't seem to care at all that he was snuffing the life from what would be their only child. After the baby had stopped crying, Jacob quietly kissed him on his little cheek and placed him in his crib. But no, that's not how it had gone at all. Lily's memory was fuzzy, but she remembered Jacob holding their baby and comforting him till he fell asleep. When she had woken up and noticed that Jonathan hadn't woken up for his feeding yet, she went to his room and found him cold and blue in his crib. She screamed for her husband, and Jacob had rushed to her side to find her cradling their poor baby as if she could bring him back to life. They called 911, but when the EMTs arrived, they said it was too late. His death was stated as SIDS, and the two had been left to mourn their loss. Lily didn't know how much more she could take in this house. She slid down the wall, crying as the crib vanished, and the room once again was empty. Lily sat there for a few minutes, getting her bearings. Then she got up and slowly walked down the stairs. She didn't want to see any more, but she knew that she had to get out of this house if she intended to have any sanity left when she escaped. As Jacob sat in the front seat, talking to his boss, he realized that Lily hadn't come out of the house yet. It had been at least an hour since he'd told her he'd catch up with her, and she should have been able to see the whole place twice in an hour. He looked up at the window that overlooked the front yard, hoping to see her looking out at him, but no such luck. "Listen, Mark, we can handle the rest of this on Monday. I need to check on Lily. She's alone in the house we're both supposed to be looking at, and I'm getting a little worried about her." "Okay, that's fine. See you Monday. Bye." As Jacob climbed out of the car and walked towards the porch, he could smell a familiar smell. He stopped in the walkway and took a deep whiff, savoring the scent he hadn't smelled in years. It was bourbon and cigar smoke, and it reminded him of the Saturday night poker games at his dad's house. Dad's poker games had been full of both, and Jacob remembered peeking in as a kid so he could watch the festivities. As he got to the door and tried to open it to join his wife, the door was locked. He knocked, wondering why she had locked it behind herself if she wanted him to come take a look. "Lily, let me in, sweetheart. I'm sorry it took so long, but you know how much of a windbag Mark can be." But Lily didn't respond. He knocked a little louder, but still no response. At this point, Jacob began to worry that something had happened to her. He pounded on the door, his fears coming back at the thought of what could be happening to his wife. Hadn't he thought this sounded like a great way to get robbed or kidnapped? He didn't know this guy from Adam, and he had just let his wife go in alone. What had he been thinking? "Lily," he yelled as he beat on the door. But no answer came. Lily walked down the steps and into the basement as if in a trance. She was numb from the torture that this house had put her through, and just wanted to be outside in the sun again before it could show her anything else. As she descended the basement stairs, the air shifted again, and she steadied herself for what was next. She opened her eyes to see that she was in her own basement, but something was off. The shelves where she kept the Christmas ornaments were pushed away from the wall. As she walked over to see why it was pulled away, she saw a trap door under where the shelf usually was. The door was open, and Lily could hear something down there. Whatever it was crying out softly, as though too weak to scream. Jacob, worried and a little angry, decided to try to find another way in. He walked around to the back of the house, but as he came to the gate, he too felt that overpowering sense of déjà vu. When he got to the backyard, he saw a swing set that looked lonely in the open space. It looked like his own swing set from when he was a kid, and he walked curiously towards it. When he reached the swing, Jacob sat down and looked at the back door. He realized it was his childhood door, and scrunched up his eyes as he tried to make sense of it. He'd spent a lot of time on his swing while his dad talked with his mom. As he watched the window by the door, Jacob saw people inside talking loudly, their silhouettes performing sad little plays for this child's eyes to watch. But this isn't how he remembered this happening. It had been just another fight, his dad starting it like always. The mailman had been sitting at their kitchen table when he came home, a cold towel on his head, as he drank a glass of his mom's lemonade. He had nearly collapsed on the front lawn in the heat, and though his father had smiled when he saw the man cooling off in his kitchen, Jacob had seen his mother flinch when he looked at her. His father had waited till after dinner to tell his son to go play out back while they talked, and his mother had seemed to beg him with her eyes not to leave. Jacob watched as his dad reached for something on the counter, and his mom's silhouette backed away slowly. His dad lunged with a sudden rage, and Jacob imagined he could hear the frying pan connect with the side of her head. His dad's dark afterimage stood over her for a few minutes, the pan coming down a few more times until sanity seemed to reassert itself. He stood up, the image realizing that it had talked a little too vigorously this time. Jacob could almost see the lack of confidence in the outline as it weighed its options. When it looked out at him, Jacob realized his father meant to make him an accomplice to his folly. "Jacob," his father yelled from the doorway, "get me a shovel from the shed. Then I need you to get in the truck and wait for me." Jacob hopped dutifully off the swing, with much smaller feet than his own. He was horrified at his blind fanaticism, but understood it all too well. As he ran to the shed to fetch the shovel, he realized that the memory of the night his mother left him wasn't the way he remembered it. Dad wasn't planting a garden to surprise her with, and Mom hadn't left them for a fella who ran the register at Ralph's. He did what he was told, though, and grabbed the shovel. He gave it to his dad and ran to the truck as his father began grunting at something that must have been very heavy in the kitchen. It couldn't have been his mother. Jacob's mom ate like a bird. Surely he wouldn't have strained so much to lift her. As soon as Jacob got in the truck, everything became hazy again. He realized he was back in his own car, his father's truck gone. As Jacob sat there, he began to cry. He didn't want to cry. He hadn't cried in so long, but found the tears just wouldn't stop. He was terrified of what had just happened. He was scared of a man he had buried 10 years ago. He was grieving for his mother in a way that he had never managed to when he was 8. Above all else, Jacob was worried about his wife. "Hello?" Lily whispered as she descended the stairs. "Who's down there? Do you need help?" She whispered, understanding the irony of her question a little too late. As she spoke, the whimpering stopped. It was dark and damp down here, the floor made of packed earth, and the smell of dirt and iron filled her nose. As she felt around for a light switch, she could hear something shifting across the room. Lily paused for a second, trying to listen to what it was. It was hard to hear over the sound of her heart beating in her ears, and Lily was afraid of getting snuck up on down here by the specters in the house again. She found a small chain hanging from a bulb in the ceiling. As she pulled it, the small light lit the room pathetically, but what she saw still terrified her. This was not any memory that she had ever had. She looked to where the sound was coming from and found herself staring back at her from a dirty mattress on the floor. She was battered and beaten, starved, with one hand attached to the wall by a metal cuff. Lily, in shock, started to back away, but heard someone walking into the basement. She quickly turned off the light and backed up against the wall, praying the darkness would hide her. As the steps got closer, Lily felt around for something to defend herself with, in case the person came downstairs. As she slid her hand across the cold dirt floor, she found what felt like a pipe, and picked it up as quickly as possible, holding it to her chest. A few moments later, she could hear heavy footsteps coming down the cellar stairs. She closed her eyes and prayed she wouldn't be seen. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the cellar. She was standing in front of the front door. Jacob got himself together and returned to the backyard to find a way in. The swing set was gone, as was the shed. The back door was no longer his childhood back door either. This door was white, with a blue ruffle at the top of the window, and the realization made him feel a little bit better. He pushed up the 3 steps to the door and turned the knob. The door opened easily, and as he walked over the threshold into the kitchen, he felt the shift again. He was in his dad's kitchen, and his father was talking to the police officer. "Mr. Daniels, do you know of anywhere your ex-wife would have gone?" the officer asked, tapping his pencil on an ancient-looking notebook. "No, officer. Like I've told you before, she called me 3 weeks ago asking to pick up our son because she needed a break from him. He can be a handful, so I agreed and went over to get my boy. She didn't tell me where she was going or when she'd come back. Jacob, go on to your room now and play. Let me and these officers finish our conversation." He had been 9 when the officers came to question his father. Jacob knew better than to disagree with the old man, but he knew that his mother had made no such request. At the time, it had seemed that maybe Daddy had been confused, but Jacob found out later that his mother had divorced him and left town with someone else. She had never tried to see Jacob again, and his father telling the police a lie had always seemed a little weird to him. One look at his father's flinty eyes, however, had told him to do as he was told, and Jacob ran for the staircase in the living room. He was walking towards the doorway when he looked back towards his father, only to find that everything was gone. The kitchen was empty now, save for him. Lily reached for the handle of the door, turning the knob with trepidation. Was this another trick? Some new game for the house to tease her with? She had never given up hope that she would get out, but she thought she might have believed the house would keep her here forever anyway. Would they even find her body, she wondered? Would they know it was her if they did? The door swung open, and Lily was again assaulted by the smell of gardenias. She came down the steps, running over the walk, and found the car exactly where she'd left it. She almost saw Jacob sitting there, the phone still pressed against his ear, but when she stuck her head into the window, she found the car was empty, the keys still hanging in the ignition. Lily wasn't sure what to make of this, and as she sat in the passenger seat, her mind started trying to make sense of what she'd seen. She realized her marriage, her whole life, was full of these little lies. Her mind made up memories to protect her from reality, but the house showed her the truth. She remembered what her father had done to her mother and what her husband did to their son, and she felt disgust well up inside her. "How could I be so stupid?" she whispered, tears coming unbidden. That still didn't explain why she had seen herself down in that cellar in such a state. As Lily thought about it, she realized she needed answers. She climbed over the driver's side and turned the key. The engine came to life, and Lily peeled the tires as she headed home. She wouldn't feel safe in that house until she checked the basement to be sure of what was there. Jacob would be angry if he came back to find the car missing, and if such a place existed in her home, she would likely find herself in there if he made it home. Jacob called out to Lily, hoping to find her safe and sound as he made it to the stairs. He could hear someone upstairs, and he kept calling for his wife as he ascended. He could hear someone crying in the bedroom to the right of him, and he was afraid that she had gotten hurt, or worse, that someone had hurt her. "Sweetheart, is that you? Are you okay?" he called out. He slowly opened the door and peeked in to see himself holding their son. His wife cried as she watched him smothering their son. The baby had been crying for hours, and Jacob couldn't handle that high-pitched squeal anymore. He snapped, and it was something he regretted every day. He had tried to move from beneath the shadow of his father, especially after what he'd done to Lily, but it seemed that you never quite forgot the old ways or the old lessons. He reached for Lily as she lay there crying, but as his hands passed through her, she turned to dust beneath his fingers. Everything melted away like dandelion fluff, and suddenly the room was empty. As he backed out of the room, he heard sobbing from the bedroom across the hall again. Jacob's hands shook as he reached for the knob, but he had to find Lily and make her understand how sorry he was for their son's death. He peeked inside as the door creaked open and could see his own bedroom. Lily was crying as she spoke to someone on the phone. She was talking about, she was talking about his little secret. She had found the root cellar, the shame he had hidden for years, and now she knew everything. He charged in, trying to stop her, but as soon as he crossed the threshold, it all just melted away. Jacob's father had often said that the apple didn't fall far from the tree, and Jacob supposed he'd been right. Lily had taken a lot of convincing, a lot of mental conditioning, but Stockholm Syndrome was an interesting thing. She never remembered how she came to be in Jacob's basement after he took her from her work one evening. She never questioned how they'd been married for 12 years when he had only snatched her 7 years ago. She had accepted that there were no pictures of their wedding because of the fire that had burned their apartment. She had accepted that their son had died of SIDS too, though he thought maybe that one had been harder to swallow than the rest. In many ways, it was like her mind created answers for questions before they were asked. By the sound of it, she had been doing that for most of her childhood. Jacob's childhood had been fraught, but Lily's had been something from a pulp novel. She'd been happy to forget, happy to cloud her own mind with misty memories and rose-colored tint. But this damn house had probably shown her all sorts of things that pulled the wool from her eyes. As Jacob sat in the empty room, he wondered if prison would be worse than living in this warped memory for the rest of his life. The whispers from the house told him that he'd never get to know. There would be no open door waiting for someone like Jacob. The house had a new toy, a new rat in its cage, and Jacob would never bask in the sun again.
The celebration of Purga Rinvadaro was a celebration that was highly anticipated in my town. The celebration is always capped off by the hunting of the mice, which was the highlight of the event. On the first day of the feast, we opened the door to find 3 masks attached to our doorknob. This occurred year after year for as long as I could remember, and I didn't think it was strange at all. Every year we would open the door, find the cat masks, long, wiry whiskers and pointy black ears, hanging from the doorknob to our home. There would be one for my mother, one for my father, and one for me. We would wear them at the festival, riding the rides and playing the games, lifting them only slightly to eat food at the feast as we gave praise to Saint Rocher. This year, however, was special for me. I was 13, old enough to do a day's work if I chose, old enough to have my own money and to have my own responsibilities, old enough to participate in what came after the feast, old enough to participate in the Purga de Ratas. I had always watched from the windows of the council hall with the other children as the people in the cat masks went about freeing us from the rats. You could see them sometimes, the big rats with their pointed noses and coarse whiskers, running through the streets as the cats turned them from wherever they had been hiding. I asked Mother what they were. They were larger than the rats I had seen in the pantry on occasions, and she had told me that these were the undesirables, those who Saint Rocher had chosen to purge from the community, and that it was the job of the town to become his cats and free the community of them. I asked her once if we could be chosen by Saint Rocher to be purged on that night. She told me I'd better pray it never happened. Those who were purged during the Purga de Ratas were cursed and removed from the town after they were destroyed. This was the year I would discover what that truly meant. I went to the festival in my mask, excited for the night to come, as I played the games, danced the Danza de Ratha, and ate at the feast. I couldn't help but think of taking to the streets with my father and mother that night to help purge the unclean from our town. Mother had said that they were Saint Rocher's enemies, said that her father had said they were filled with spirits who had brought the plague to our city when she was a girl. If they didn't purge all of them, they would bring it there again. I was excited to go out and bring honor to my family as I drove these rats out of the city, but I was a little scared too. It was that feeling you get just before doing something dangerous and exciting, like riding a wild horse. You fear the action, but you can't wait for the ride. I was a little sad, though. My friend Maria wasn't there. She never missed the festival, and not seeing her made me wonder if she was sick. Her father wasn't a nice man, my father said. He didn't support the festival, and he had tried to argue for having it canceled many times. He always seemed nice to me when I visited Maria, but I knew well enough not to argue with my father. I didn't see Maria all day, and as we went home with the setting sun, I hoped I would see her tonight. We returned home and ate at the midnight feast that my parents always ate before it was time to go to the night's work. I tucked in greedily, knowing that I would need my strength for what was to come. God help me. I was so young, I didn't know what was in store for me. As we ate, I asked my mother about the people who didn't go to the festival. She looked critically, asking what I meant. I told her I saw someone peeking through the windows of their home. They'd moved away from the window quickly, but I had marked them by their whiskers and their beady eyes. Mother said that those people were not to be trusted, and that clearly they had been infested by the spirits Saint Rocher wanted us to expel from the city that night. I nodded, making a note of that house in my mind. Their house was close to ours, and my parents and I could get there easily and chase them out. When the deep thrum of the midnight bell tolled, Father donned his mask and led us to the kitchen. There would be no need to take me to the chapel for safekeeping that night. He handed each of us a knife from the knife block, saving the sharpest knife for me. It was a long, curved fillet knife, and he told me not to be afraid to swing it hard. These aren't people anymore, and we must expunge the plague from the city. I nodded, not understanding entirely, but I soon would. We left the house, and I took them to the house I had seen earlier, seeing the other cats as they moved through the city. They were moving in clusters, groups of 5 or 10, and soon we would be taken into the clouder easily. The other cats around me were a comfortable weight, all of them people I knew, though I didn't know that I knew them. They followed us as we went, letting us lead them to the rats. The lights were off when we approached, the house dark and the windows shuttered. I figured this would be the time that we would scare the mice out of their holes. I'd seen my kitten, Georgette, scare mice out of their holes before. She would pretend to be interested in one hole, and then when the mice would poke their heads out of the other hole and come hesitantly out, she would dash at them and scare them out of the house. She would run them and run them. Her little kitten energy was boundless, until Mother finally saw them, swept them out with her broom, crying, "Purga de ratas," as she swept them from our house. But we were no kittens, it seems, and this city did not hunt like that. The stone made me jump when it crashed through the window. The window shattered inward, and I heard someone shriek. We had scared the rats, and now they would come running out. But this was also how kittens hunted. Several of the cats, the ones with clubs as well as knives, cleared the glass out of the window and climbed through easily. The shrieks from inside were undoubtedly more human than mouse-like, but when the door burst open, one of the rats ran for it, just like the rats at home. No broom came out to sweep him away. The clouder fell on him, and I saw his hands come up to reach as the knives came down. I stopped as I saw what they were doing, feeling a little sick, as I saw the blood leaking from the rat. He was bigger than I had expected, bigger than me, and he twitched as he lay there. I took a step back, not really wanting to get close, but my mother pushed me forward as her hands stopped my retreat. I looked back into her cat mask and saw her gentle eyes as she pushed me again. "Go on, honey. Get a cut in." I stepped forward, some of my excitement dulled by fear, and saw the gurgling rat looking up at me as it bled onto the cobbles. Its black eyes stared at me, and it coughed wetly, though its lips didn't move. I held my knife in a shaky hand, preparing to strike, when the rat suddenly reached out for me, locking its hand around my ankles. My fear gripped me, and I suddenly stabbed out with the knife. I stabbed the rat again and again and again, closing my eyes as I stabbed his arm, his back, his neck. The hand went limp as he flopped onto the cobbles. The clouder cheered, and we were off again. We ran, drunk off our own power, and found a pair of rats in the street as they dodged another group. They were cutting down an alley as we came upon them, but they looked up at our group as it came close. One of them took off down the alley, but the other just stood there, frozen in terror, as the clouder fell on her. She screamed as we stabbed her, but I broke off to pursue the other one as they finished stabbing and beating her. I didn't want her to get away, and my blood was up. I'd be lying if I said I didn't want one of the rats for myself, too. I ran after her, leaving the others behind, and found her just as she hit the wall of the alley. She turned, seeing me, and started looking around fitfully. I could almost taste her fear as I closed in, knife at the ready. I, too, would purge my town of rats. "Please," she begged, and her words gave me pause. She was speaking. Did rats speak? None of the rats I'd ever seen spoke. Of course, none of the rats I had ever seen were big either. The speaking rat made me falter for a moment, and she took full advantage of this as she tried to reason with me. Please don't hurt me. I'll give you whatever you want. I just don't want to die." I heard the clouder coming up behind me, yelling as they came, and their presence gave me strength. I ran forward, and I shoved the knife at her, the blade sinking into her abdomen as she tried to back away. As it went in, I yelled, "Purga de ratas!" and I could see her dress starting to redden as her hands gripped the knife. She cut her fingers, and she fell to her knees as the clouder came into the alley with a shout of mirth. I pulled the knife out and ran to my father. He pulled me into his arms and whispered, "You're a natural." At that moment, I was so proud. My family was doing something special, and we were united. Sometimes it almost felt like we lived on our own, only seeing each other for dinner. But now we were doing something we could all enjoy, and I couldn't wait till next year. I didn't have the slightest idea what I was doing, but I would soon find out. I followed the clouder, growing bolder as we went, until until we came to the next house. They pounded on the door, yelling for the rats to come out and face their fate. Everyone else was waiting expectantly, waiting for the door to open so they could charge the house and kill these rats. I was confused, though. There must have been a mistake. This couldn't be the rats' house. They were looking for rocks to break the window, but I just shook my head and felt my confusion mount. This couldn't be the right house. This was Maria's house. The door opened suddenly, and Maria's father stepped out onto the stoop. He wasn't wearing a mask. His face was set in a stoic cast, and he raised his rifle and pointed it at the mob. Some of them backed away, but most of them only seemed to take more pleasure from his presence. They mumbled to themselves, gripping their knives and preparing to charge. Maria's father cast his gaze around at them, his eyes falling on me for a moment before sliding away. "I'm not wearing that damn mask. This whole celebration is an abomination. If you mean to take my family, then you can come and try. I'll take a few of you with me. Just remember, which of you will be wearing a rat mask next year?" I backed away from the clouder, slowly, my knife hitting the cobbles. No one noticed the metallic sound, or the scream that followed it as the rifle blammed loudly. One of the cats had charged him, thinking he wouldn't shoot, and now he lay bleeding on his doorstep. The gun went off again a moment later, but I didn't see who had been killed that time. I was running, head down, my mask forgotten, as I turned from the carnage that I now understood was not a magic festival or a fight for our town from giant rats. We were killing our friends, our neighbors, and I would never understand why. I ran as the tears streamed down my face, and I didn't stop running until the sounds of rats and cats were behind me. I ran until the woods enveloped me, the lush fairy tale woods that seemed to surround our home. The trees whipped at me, the roots pulled at me, and I just kept running. I ran from the horror, from the chaos, and I didn't stop until the ground went out from under me. Suddenly I was tumbling, I was rolling down something, and I put my hands up to my face to protect myself. I was so confused, so frightened, and when I hit my head on something, my vision got very blurry. I kept rolling, struggling to maintain my consciousness. I was slapping against the bushes and banging against small rocks, and when I finally came to a rest, I felt warm, solid ground beneath me. When the lights engulfed me, leaving me in a warm circle, I passed out. I woke up in a hospital. The nurses said I had been found lying on a major highway, a truck driver having brought me here after calling the police. I had been unconscious for a while, a day at least, and I had a pretty massive head wound that would need to heal. The doctor said I had a small skull fracture, and that I definitely had a concussion. They kept me for a month, most of which was trying to get me to tell them who I was and where I was from. I feigned memory loss. The women in Mother's books lost their memories sometimes after an accident. I did not want to go back home. I knew for a fact that if I went home, after running away from the festival, that my family might very well find rat masks on their door next year. I also didn't want to face the wrath of my parents and my community. No one refused to participate in the festival, or, like Maria's father, they were made to play the rats. After a month, I was sent to an orphanage where I was adopted. The country I'm from doesn't have the best track record when it comes to placing children into foster homes, or even having them adopted by good families, but I suppose I got lucky. Glenda and Mark were from the United States, here to do missionary work. When Glenda heard about my story, she became interested in me. She said that it seemed to be God's will that she help me, and they adopted me right then and there. They stayed for a few years, helping me get back on my feet, and when they went home, they helped me gain citizenship and become a United States citizen. I moved with them to San Diego and attended college. I never told them about my village or the Perga Rinvadaro, and they never pushed me. I think they suspected that my amnesia was self-inflicted, and they're honestly the best parents I ever could have asked for. I'm 30 now, married with a new baby in a place of my own. My husband, Marco, is a wonderful father, and we couldn't be happier. He works as a civil engineer for a large company, and I work as a nurse when I'm not at home with Hugo. Glenda and Mark, my mom and dad, are always welcome at our house, and I can't imagine a better life than the one I have. A life that my past is threatening to take away. You see, when I went to get the mail today, I noticed something hanging on the door of our apartment. I saw the masks, laughing and thinking it was a Halloween thing from the neighbors. But when I picked them up, the wiry whiskers stuck painfully into my hand. I dropped them and stared in horror. They were masks, all right. 3 of them, and they all were gray lacquered faces of rats. The whiskers were frayed metal wires, and the nose of one had been broken in the fall, a delicate black bulb that now lay on the pavement beside the mask. There were 3 masks, as I said, and the third was the one that filled me with the most dread. 2 were normal-sized, easily capable of fitting an adult face, but the third was small, delicate, the eyes carved to make it look scared and sad. A mask for a baby. There was a note inside one, and I thought I would tear it as my shaking hands reached out to open it. The paper was rough, handmade, and the ink was thick and blocky. The village made its own paper, its own ink, and rarely traded with others. I had no doubt that the masks had been made by the same old man that used to make them every year. I felt the tears come on, and as I read the note, the concrete bit into my knees as I went down to them to sob into the paper. The note read, "Joyous Purga Rinvadaro. Join us this evening for the Purga de Ratas. If you cannot attend, don't worry. We will bring the celebration to you."
Mark and I grew up together, meeting in nursery school when we were about 2. We played with the same toys, learned the same games, read the same books, and when we started school, we were both delighted to find that we were in the same class. I didn't really notice the chair at the foot of his bed until we were 6. We were playing Super Nintendo in Mark's room, being rambunctious and probably making a lot of noise. Our game of Mario Kart had turned into a little bit of horseplay, and when I bumped into the old wooden chair at the end of his bed, he jumped up like he'd been scalded. He picked it up, dusting the seat like it might be offended as he placed it carefully back where it had been. "Sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to push your chair over." "That's okay. It's just got to sit there. It's kind of important." "Why is that?" I asked as he reached for his controller to go back to playing the game as if nothing had happened. "Oh, that's where my guardian angel sits at night." He said it in that way that made it very clear this was both something he believed in and was as normal to him as the toast he'd had for breakfast. When he noticed I hadn't picked up my controller to begin playing again, he looked back at me in confusion and seemed surprised by my look of stunned interest. "Your what?" "My guardian angel," he said. "What, you don't have one at the end of your bed every night?" I told him I didn't, and he seemed surprised. "Huh, Mom said everybody had them." He tried to go back to the game again, but I found myself much more interested in this guardian angel thing than our game of Mario Kart. As kids, you get used to hearing your playmates spout out about all kinds of odd things. Sometimes they don't really make sense. This, however, had been endorsed by a grown-up. To a kid barely into his 7th year, the word of an adult was still something I put a lot of stock into. If his mom had told him this, then it had to be true. And if a real angel sat at the end of his bed every night, then I wanted to know more about it, or even see it if I could. "Okay," he said, so when I was little, I woke up and found something at the foot of the bed that scared me. I thought it was a monster at first, but when I went and told my mom about it, she said it was my guardian angel. After that, we left a chair so that it could sit, since before it had just been standing at the foot of the bed. "And it comes every night?" "Every night. And now I'm not afraid of him, since I know that he's there to watch over me." The whole thing interested me greatly. Mark's family didn't strike me as particularly religious. I don't even think he went to church. So the idea of Mark having a guardian angel and not me was a little bit weird. If it was a real thing and Mark wasn't just pulling my leg, I wanted to see it too. That was when I started bothering Mark's mother, my mother, and Mark about having me over for a sleepover. We were getting to that age where sleepovers were pretty common, but it seemed like they just never had a good time to do it. There were always weekend plans. My parents were religious, so we always went to church on Sundays. I started trying for Friday night or Saturday maybe, but there just always seemed to be something to stop us from spending the night at his house. As if in answer, Mark came to stay at my house a couple of times. That was fun, but it ultimately wasn't what I wanted. We couldn't see Mark's guardian angel at my house after all, so I kept asking and asking if I could stay the night, and finally we found a time that made it work. We were in second grade, a whole 2 years after I started asking, when my parents suddenly needed to go out of town and didn't have a way to bring me with them. It was right in the middle of the school year, and they needed to go to a funeral from Thursday morning to Friday night. It wasn't really the sort of thing you could bring a kid to, and I suggested that maybe I could stay with Mark. My parents liked the idea. We had hosted Mark a few times, so his parents could have a date night or visit relatives, and so they called to see if it was something they could do. Mark's parents said they'd be happy to help, and I was filled with excitement as I packed my bag for a couple of days at Mark's house. Wednesday night was a blast. Mark's dad grilled hamburgers in the backyard while we played on the slip and slide. Mark's mom had rented a game from Blockbuster that we took turns playing. We watched some TV in the living room. His parents said we could stay up a little later than usual, and when his mother said it was time for us to get ready for bed, I felt excited all over again. As I lay on my pallet that night, sleeping in the shadow underneath Mark's bed, I was filled with anticipation as I watched the chair. I'd waited for years to see this, and I wasn't going to sleep until I saw it. The chair just sat there, a mute hunk of wood, and as the lights went out and Mark's last-minute chatter turned into soft snoring, I tried my best to stay awake. I wanted to see it, but as I began to yawn more frequently, I wasn't sure I'd make it. I wondered if Mark really had just been pulling my leg, and as the alarm clock on the nightstand went from 10:30 to 11, I thought it'd be a real joke if there never was an angel, and he'd just been having a laugh at me all these years. As my eyes grew heavy, I tried to keep awake until it got there. Inevitably, though, I lost the fight and fell asleep. I came awake suddenly in the unfamiliar darkness of Mark's bedroom. It was very early, and as I sat up with a start, I remember feeling that momentary sense of confusion. Where was I? What was going on? That was when I remembered that I was at a sleepover at Mark's, and why I was at a sleepover at Mark's. I glanced up at the chair, expecting to see something in white robes with wings and a halo, but I was disappointed in that respect. Disappointed, but utterly terrified. What I saw was a shapeless shadow with vaguely human proportions. The dimensions seemed to move when I watched it, though I don't think it had noticed me. It was leaning forward in the chair, staring at Mark like a hungry shark, and it didn't turn to look at me until I started screaming. It shifted its soupy face towards me, and I saw a pair of dancing red eyes amidst the miasma. It went right on looking at me until someone turned the lights on, and as the room came into view, the creature was just gone. Mark's mother was sympathetic, asking what had happened, and I lied and told her I just had a bad dream. She bought it, I think, but I think Mark knew what I had seen. He tried to ask me about it, but I rolled over and faced the wall as I pretended to go back to sleep. Mark tried again as his mom took us to school the next day, but I didn't want to talk about it. I was as terrified of what I had seen as I was disappointed at the outcome of my curiosity. My parents picked me up from school that day, having gotten back a little early, and I think they too sensed that something had happened. I slept more soundly in my own bed than I ever had before, and I never asked to sleep at Mark's house again. I may have never asked to spend the night at his house. But Mark and I remained good friends. I still went over to his house, I still hung out in his bedroom, but I never stayed after dark again. Incidentally, since the sleepover had been such a success, his mother let Mark stay over at our house more often. This seemed to work better for Mark's parents, too, and looking back, I don't think they got along well. They argued a lot, and many of the trips they took together ended abruptly without helping their marriage. When they divorced after Mark graduated high school, I think it was only really a surprise to Mark. They decided to sell the house and split the money, and Mark decided to move out on his own and start his adult life a little earlier than he had expected. So, when he asked if I wanted to be his roommate, it seemed like a no-brainer. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near the college Mark was attending, and it was pretty cool. We got on about as well as 2 high school kids moving in for the first time together could. There were arguments about chores, loud parties that probably bothered the neighbors, late-night underage drinking sessions where we told each other all sorts of things, and plenty of general day-to-day life stuff. The things we had meshed well together in our new home, except for one thing he had brought from his old house that stirred up some memories I didn't want to think about. I was helping him move his things out of the back of his dad's F-150 when I caught sight of something that I hadn't thought about in years, though it had played quite often in my nightmares. Picking up a stack of boxes revealed a familiar wooden chair that had sat at the end of Mark's bed for as long as I could remember. It was the chair that the angel had sat in and watched him sleep. I asked him why he had brought it with him, and he looked at me like I was a fool. It's where my guardian angel sits. Duh. Why wouldn't I bring it? I had kind of hoped that the angel was just an at his house kind of thing, and the thought that it might be in our apartment at night gave me the creeps. My boss had been asking if I'd be interested in working the night shift for months, and after seeing that chair sat with such care at the end of his bed, I went and told my boss that I was ready to accept. I wanted to live with Mark and help him out, but I just couldn't stand being in that house at night. I could tell that Mark was a little miffed that I wouldn't be at home at night. Night was kind of the only time he wasn't at school or work, but he understood that the bills had to be paid. I don't think he actually understood why I'd taken the night shift. If I was off, I always kept my door locked and slept facing the wall. If the angel ever came into my room, I never knew about it. I certainly never left a chair at the foot of my bed, and I guess if it came to our house, it stayed in Mark's room. Though I guess in the end, it worked in Mark's favor. I was at work one night, playing on my phone and watching cameras, when my phone rang. I saw that it was Mark and figured he was just making sure I was going to be home in the morning before he had to go to school. When I picked up, however, he sounded frantic. Mark was yelling about needing me home right away and how he needed help calling the police. I told him to calm down and just go ahead and call the cops, but he said he couldn't until he cleaned up a little bit. Then he said the most chilling thing I'd heard since we were kids. The angel got him. Got who? I asked, still not sure what was going on. The intruder that broke into our house. I called my boss and told him about the situation, and he agreed to come work for me so that I could get things sorted out. I offered to come back, but he said there was no need. I was probably looking at police reports and other paperwork anyway, but to let him know if I wasn't going to be in tomorrow night so that he could make arrangements. He even said he'd pay me for the night. My boss was a good guy, one of the best bosses I've ever had, and I always appreciated how helpful he was. By the time I got home, Mark was in a tizzy. With good reason, too, since it looked like someone had exploded across his floor. There was blood on the walls, blood on the carpet, blood across the bedspread of Mark's bed, as well as hair, meat, and bones everywhere. The bones were splintered and broken, and everything looked like someone had been fed into a wood chipper. I didn't know what to make of it, but the most striking was the blood splashed across the plain wooden chair that sat placidly amidst the gore. I pulled Mark into the living room and asked him to tell me exactly what had happened. After a few glasses of water and a little scotch, he finally stopped shaking enough to tell me. He said he had heard the guy come in with a key, and he thought it was me. He had rolled over and went back to sleep, already seeing the angel there and feeling safe as he usually did. When he heard rustling in the living room, he thought it was a little odd, but figured I was just settling in for some gaming. When his bedroom door opened, he knew something was amiss. I didn't usually go into his room at night, especially not after what Mark considered bedtime, and the door opening made him turn to confront whoever it was. He had sat up in bed, looking at the person silhouetted in the hall light, and that's when he saw the angel turn its head to look at the intruder. "What the hell?" the guy said, his voice deep and confused. Mark said he had taken a step into the room, fiddling with something in his pocket, but he never got out what he intended to use. Suddenly the angel was standing, and Mark said it just sort of blurred at the guy. He knew how that sounded, but it was like one minute it was standing beside the chair, and the next they had been face to face in the doorway. He had reached out towards him, his hand sinking into the man's chest, and the intruder had made a noise like he was having indigestion. The angel simply pulled him to pieces. He had ripped him right down the middle, long ways, and that had been where most of the blood had come from. He had thrown him against the wall, well, half of him, and the other half he had dragged to the floor and began to eat. Mark said that had been the worst part, watching it eat. It didn't eat like a normal creature. It ate by pressing its formless head against the body. Parts of the body just disappeared. It was like watching something that I couldn't see devour somebody. As it ate, Mark had gotten shakily out of bed and moved slowly around the perimeter of the room. He had watched the thing as he went, unsure whether it would hurt him or not, and when he came to the door, his hands trembled as he reached for the light switch. Just as the lights came on, the creature had looked up in surprise. Its eyes almost looked betrayed, and as he dissipated, Mark was left with the remains of its feast. I don't know what to do. The cops are never going to believe that some weird angel that I've had since I was a kid tore this guy apart. This is a little excessive, even for a home invader, and I'm afraid that I'm going to be in trouble. It's probably going to incriminate both of us for me to put this in here, but we came up with a story that wouldn't sound quite so crazy. The story was that Mark had been in the bathroom when the guy came in. Mark had locked the door and hunkered down to wait on them while they started taking things. While hiding, Mark heard something going on in the bedroom, and when everything had gone quiet, he came out to find the guy like that. It was a shaky story. The cops were likely to raise an eyebrow at it, but Mark isn't a very big guy, and the idea that he might have hidden instead of trying to confront a home invader isn't too far-fetched. No more far-fetched than the idea that he could rip a guy in half. So we called the cops, and after answering some questions and a trip to the station for some more questions, we were put up in a hotel for the night while they checked out our apartment. It turned out that the guy who had come in to rob us was the landlord's nephew. We've had several apartments that had been broken into without much sign of a break-in, and the cops finally had their answer. The nephew has been using the keys from the main office to go into people's houses, and he usually chooses places where no one was likely to be home. I'd met the nephew on the on-site gym a few times, and he knew I worked nights and likely thought my apartment would be empty, not realizing I had a roommate. They found a lot of evidence at the nephew's apartment, an apartment owned by his uncle, too, so the case seemed pretty open and shut. Most of them thought that he'd had an accomplice who was on drugs or something, and the two had just gotten into a brutal exchange over some of the plunder. We actually got a small reward for calling it in, though I think our landlord had mixed feelings about the whole incident. Mark threw the chair out after that. He just didn't feel safe with it at the end of his bed anymore. The angel had been his guardian, and it had protected him, though maybe a little overzealously. It's unclear whether Mark would still be alive if it hadn't been there, but it seemed that, like me, Mark had seen more than he was comfortable with when he'd seen it attack the guy. He put the chair by the dumpster and Somebody must have taken it because it was gone by the next day. I don't know if the angel still comes back to the foot of his bed or not, but if it does, I guess it's standing these days. Charles stepped into Funland Amusement and ground his teeth at the sight of children playing skee-ball and air hockey and the waka 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 of Pac-Man that filled the air. The great Gizmo, reduced to playing chess in a place like this. The owner started to say something to the well-dressed gentleman, but Charles waved him off. He didn't need directions. He and Gizmo were old friends, and he could practically smell the old gypsy from here. That was one of those words his great-great-grandchildren would have told him was a cancelable offense, but Charles didn't care. Much like the great Gizmo, Charles was from a different age. Charles had first met Gizmo in 1919, when the world was still new and things made sense. It had been at an expo in Coney Island, and his father had been rabid to see it. "They say it's from Europe, and it's been touring since the 1800s. It's supposed to play chess like a grandmaster, Charlie boy, and they claim it's never been beaten. I want you to be the first one to do it, kiddo." Charlie's father had been a trainman, an engineer, and a grease monkey who had never gotten farther than the 5th grade. He had learned everything he knew at the side of better men, but he knew Charlie was special. Charles was 9 and already doing high school math, and not just reading Shakespeare, but understanding what he meant, doing numbers good enough to get a job at the broker's house if he wanted it. His father wouldn't hear of it, though. No genius son of his was going to run numbers for bingo boys, not when he could get an education and get away from this cesspool. Education, Charlie, that's what's going to lift you above the rest of us. Higher learning is what's going to get you a better life than your old man. One thing his dad did love, though, was chess. Most of the train guys knew the typical games: cards, dice, checkers, chess. But Charlie's dad had loved the game best of all. He was no grand master, barely above a novice, but he had taught Charles everything he knew about it from a very young age. Charles had absorbed it like a sponge. He was one of the best in the boroughs, maybe one of the best in the city, and he'd taken 3rd in the Central Park chess finals just last year. And that was against guys 3 times your age, kid, his dad had crowed. Now, he wanted his son to take on the great Gizmo. The exhibition was taking place in a big tent not far from the show hall, and it was standing room only. Lots of people wanted to see this machine that could beat a man at chess, and they all wanted a turn to try it out. Most of them wouldn't, Charlie knew, but they wanted the chance to watch it beat better men than them so they could feel superior for a little while. Charles didn't intend to give them the satisfaction. The man who'd introduced the thing was dressed in a crisp red and white striped suit, his flat-topped hat making him look like a carnival barker. He had thumped his cane and called the crowd to order, his eyes roving the men and women as if searching for the right victim. "Ladies and gentlemen, what I have here is the most amazing technical marvel of the last century. He has bested kings, geniuses, and politicians in the art of chess, and is looking for his next challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the great Gizmo." Charles hadn't been terribly impressed when the man tore back the tarp to reveal the thing. It looked like a fortune teller, dressed in a long red robe with a turban on its head, boasting a tall feather and a large gem with many facets. It had a beard, a long mustachio that dripped with rings and bells, and a pair of far too expressive eyes. It moved jerkily, like something made of wires, and the people oohed and awed over it, impressed. Now then, who will be the first to test its staggering strategy? Only $5 for the chance to best the great Gizmo. Charlie's father had started to step forward, but Charles put a hand on his arm. Let's watch for a moment, Dad. I want to see how he plays. You sure? I figured you'd stomp it first, and then we'd walk off with the glory. I'm sure, Charles said, standing back to watch as the first fellow approached, paying his money and taking a seat. This was how Charles liked to play. First came the observation period, where he watched and made plans. He liked to stand back, blending in with the crowd so he could take the measure of his opponents. People rarely realized you were studying their moves, planning counter moves, and when you stepped up and trounced them, they never saw it coming. That was always his favorite part, watching their time-tested strategies fall apart as they played on and destroyed themselves by second-guessing their abilities. That hadn't happened that day in the tent at Coney Island. As much as he watched and as much as he learned, Charles never quite understood the strategies at play with the great Gizmo. He stuck to no gambits, he initiated no set strategy, and he was neither aggressive nor careful. He answered their moves with the best counter move available every time, and he never failed to thwart them. After 5 others had been embarrassed, to the general amusement of the crowd, Charles decided it was his turn. "A kid?" the barker asked. "Mister, I'll take your money, but I hate to steal from a man." His father had puffed up at that. "Charlie's a chess prodigy. He'll whip your metal man." And so, Charles took his seat, setting eye to glass eye with the thing, and the game began. Charles would play a lot of chess in his lifetime, but he would never play a game quite that one-sided again. The great Gizmo thwarted him at every move, countered his counters, ran circles around him, and by the end, Charles wasn't sure he had put up any sort of fight at all. He had a middling collection of pieces, barely anything, and Gizmo had everything. "Checkmate," the thing had rasped, its voice full of secret humor, and Charles had nodded before walking away in defeat. "No sweat, Charlie boy," his father had assured him. "Damn creepy thing's a cheat anyway. That's what it is, just a cheatin' bit of nothing." Charles hadn't said anything, but he had made a vow to beat the pile of wires next time the chance arose. Charles saw the great Gizmo sitting in the back of the arcade, forgotten and unused. He didn't know how much the owner had paid for it, but he doubted it was making it back. The great Gizmo was a relic. No one came to the arcade to play chess anymore. There was a little placard in front of him telling his history, and a sign that asked patrons not to damage the object. The camera overhead likely helped with that, but there was likely more to it than that. The great Gizmo looked like something that shouldn't exist, something that flew in the face of this uncanny valley that his great-grandson talked about sometimes, and people found it off-putting. Charles, however, was used to it. "Do you remember me?" he asked, putting a quarter in as the thing shuddered and seemed to look up at him. Its robes were faded, its feather ragged, but its eyes were still intelligent. "Charles," it croaked, just as it had on that long-ago day. Charles had been in his second year of high school when he met the great Gizmo for the second time. School was more of a formality than anything. He could pass any test that a college entrance board could throw at him, but they wouldn't give him the chance until he had a diploma. He was 16, a true prodigy now, and his chess skills had only increased over the years. He had taken Ruby Fawn to the fair that year, and that was where he saw the sign proclaiming the Great Gizmo would be in attendance. He had drug her over to the tent, the girl saying that she didn't want to see that creepy old thing, but he wanted a second chance at it. His father was still working in the grease pits of the train yard, but he knew his face would light up when he heard how his son had bested his old chess rival. The stakes had increased in 7 years, it seemed. It was now $8 to play the champ, but the winner got a $50 cash prize. $50 was a lot of money in 1926, but Charles wanted the satisfaction of besting this thing more than anything. Despite what his father wanted, he had been running numbers for John McClure and his gang for over a year, and some well-placed bets had left him flush with cash. "Good luck, young man," said the barker, and Charles was surprised to find that it was the same barker as before. Time had not been kind to him. His suit was now faded, his hat frayed around the rim, and he'd put on weight which bulged around the middle and made the suit roll, spoiling the uniform direction of the stripes. Despite that, it was still him, and he grinned at Charles as he took his familiar seat. This time, the match was a little different. Charles had increased in skill, and he saw through many of the traps Gizmo set for him. The audience whispered quietly behind him, believing that the great Gizmo had met his match, but the real show was just beginning. Charles had taken several key pieces, and as he took a second rook, the thing's eyes sparkled, and it bent down as if to whisper something to him. The crowd would not have heard it. Its voice was too low, but the great Gizmo whispered a secret to Charles that would stick with him forever. "Charles, this will not be our last game. We will play 8 more times before the end." It was given in a tone of absolute certainty, not an offhanded statement made to get more of Charles's hard-earned money. Charles looked mystified, not sure if he had actually heard what the thing had said, and it caused him to flub his next move and lose a piece he had not wanted to. Charles persevered, however, pressing on and taking more pieces, and just as he believed that victory was within his grasp, the thing spoke again. "Charles, you will live far longer than you may wish to." Again, it was spoken in that tone of absolute assuredness, and it caused Charles to miss what would have been obvious. The great Gizmo won after 2 more moves, and Charles was again defeated. "Better luck next time," said the barker, and even Charles's date told him that he had done really well. Charles knew that he would never be great until he beat this machine, though. The pieces appeared. Charles set his up, and they began what would be their 4th game. Charles, strategically meeting the machine's offensive plays with his own practiced gambits, would gladly admit that the 3 games he had played against the great Gizmo had improved his chess game more than any other matches he had ever played. Charles had faced old-timers in the park, grand masters at chess tournaments, and everything in between. Despite it all, the great Gizmo never ceased to amaze and test his skill. Charles tried not to think of that last match. It was a match where Charles had done the one thing he promised he would never do. He had cheated. The great Gizmo had become something of a mania in him after he had lost to it a second time. He'd gone to college, married his sweetheart, and began a job that paid well and wasn't terribly difficult. With his business acumen, Charles had been placed as the manager of a textile mill. Soon, He had bought it and was running the mill himself. Charles had turned the profits completely around after he had purchased the mill, seeing what the owner was doing wrong and fixing it when the mill belonged to him. He'd come a long way from the little kid who sat in the tent at Coney Island, but that tent was never far from his mind. Charles had one obsession, and it was chess. Even his father had told him he took the game far too seriously. He and his father still played at least twice a week, and it was mostly a chance for the two to talk. His father was not able to work the train yard anymore. He lost a leg to one of the big locomotives when it had fallen out of the hoist onto him, but that hardly mattered. His father lived at the home that Charles shared with his wife, a huge mansion on the main street of town, and his days were spent at leisure now. "You're the best chess player I've ever met, Charlie, but you take it too seriously. It's just a game, an entertainment, but you treat every chess match like a war." Charles would laugh when he said these things, but his father was right. Every chess match was a war, and the general behind all those lesser generals was the great Gizmo. He had seen the old golem in various fairs and sideshows, but he had resisted the urge to go and play again. He couldn't beat him, not yet, and when he did play him, he wanted to be ready. He had studied chess the way some people study law or religion. He knew everything, at least everything that he could learn from books and experience, but it appeared he had one more teacher to take instruction from. Charles liked to go to the park and play against the old-timers that stayed there. Some of them had been playing chess longer than he'd been alive, and they had found ways to bend or even break the established rules of strategy. On the day in question, he was playing against a young black man. He called himself Kenny, and when he had taken Charles's rook, something strange happened. The rook was gone, but so had his knight that had been beside it. Charles knew the knight had been there, but when he looked across the board, he saw that it was sitting beside the rook on Kenny's side. He still won the match. Charles was at a point where he could win with nearly any 4 pieces on the board, but when they played again, he reached out and caught Kenny by the wrist as he went to take his castle off the board. In his hand was a pawn as well, and Kenny grinned like it was all a big joke. Charles wasn't mad, though. On the contrary. The move had been so quick, so smooth, that he hadn't even seen it the first time. He wondered if it would work for a creature that did not possess sight. It might be just the edge that he was looking for. "Hey, man, we ain't playing for money or nothing. There's no need to get upset over it." "Show me," Charles asked, and Kenny was more than happy to oblige. Kenny showed him the move, telling him the piece he palmed always had to be on the right of the piece that you would take. If it's on the left, they focus on that piece. If it's on the right, though, then the piece is practically hidden by the one you just put down. You can't hesitate. It's got to be a smooth move. But if you're quick enough, and you're sure enough, it's damn near undetectable. Charles practiced the move for hours, even using it against his own father, something he felt guilty about. He could do it without hesitation, without being noticed, and he was proud of his progress, despite the trickery. He was practicing it for 2 years before he got the chance to take on the great Gizmo again. By then, Charles was a master of not just chess, but of that little sleight of hand. He hadn't dared use it at any of the chess tournaments. The refs were just too vigilant, as were the players. But in casual games, as well as at the park, he had become undetectable by any but the most observant. He was good enough to do it without hesitation, and when he opened his paper and saw a squib that the great Gizmo would be at Coney Island that weekend, right before going overseas for a 10-year tour, he knew this would be his chance. There was no fee to play against it this time. The Barker was still there, but he looked a little less jolly these days. He was an old, fat man who had grown sour and less jovial. He looked interested in being gone from here, in getting to where he would be paid more for the show. He told Charles to take a spot in line, and as the players took their turns, many of them people Charles had bested already, they were quickly turned away with a defeat at the hands of the golem. The great Gizmo looked downright dapper as he sat there, seeing that the man had gotten him a new robe and a feather for his journey. The eyes still sparkled knowingly, however, and Charles settled himself so as not to be thrown by any declaration of future knowledge this time. The pieces came out, and the game began. Charles did well at first. He was cutting a path through the great Gizmo's defenses, and the thing again told him they would play 8 more times before the end. That was a constant, it seemed, but after that, the match turned ugly. The great Gizmo recaptured some of his pieces and set them to burning. Charles was hurting, but still doing well. He took a few more, received his next expected bit of prophecy, and then the play became barbaric. The great Gizmo was playing very aggressively, and Charles had to maneuver himself to stay one step ahead of the thing. He became desperate, trying to get the old golem into position, and when he saw the move, he took it. He had palmed a knight and a pawn when something unexpected happened. The great Gizmo grabbed his hand, just as he had grabbed Kenny's, and it leaned down until its eyes were inches from his. It breathed out, its breath full of terrible smoke and awful prophecy, and Charles began to choke. The smoke filled his mouth, taking his breath, and he blacked out as he fell sideways. The thing let go of him as he fell, but his last image of the great Gizmo was of its 2 expressive eyes watching him with disappointment. He'd been found wanting again, and Charles wondered before passing out if there would be a 4th time. Charles woke up 3 days later in the hospital, his wife rejoicing that God had brought him back to them. By then, the great Gizmo was on a boat to England, out of his reach. The year after that, World War II would erupt, and Charles had feared that he would never get another match with this creature. The match began as it always did. Charles put aside the great Gizmo's gambits, one at a time. He played brilliantly, thwarting the golem's best defenses, and then it came time to attack. He cut the great Gizmo to shreds, his line all a-tatter, and when he told him that they would play 8 games before the end, Charles knew he was advancing well. He had lost barely any pieces of his own, and as the thing began to set its later plans in order, he almost laughed. This was proving to be too easy. The great Gizmo and the Barker had been in Poland when it fell to the Blitzkrieg, and the great Gizmo had dropped off the face of the earth for a while. Charles had actually enlisted after Pearl Harbor, but not for any sense of patriotism. He had a mania growing in him, and it had been growing for years. He knew where the thing had last been, and he meant that he would find the Barker and his mysterious machine. The Army was glad to have him, and his time in college made it easy to become an officer after basic training. They offered him a desk job, something in shipping, but he turned them down. If he wanted to find the great Gizmo, he would have to go to war. He had fought at Normandy and Paris and 100 other skirmishes, and that was where he discovered something astounding. Despite the danger that Charles put himself in, he didn't die. Charles was never more than slightly wounded, a scratch or a bruise, but sustained no lasting damage. He wondered how this could be, but then he remembered the words of the great Gizmo. "You will live far longer than you may wish to." He returned home after the war, but the old construct never returned to America. It took a while for his contacts to get back on their feet, but eventually what he got were rumors and hearsay. He heard that Hitler had taken the thing, adding it to his collection of objects he believed to be supernatural. He heard it had been destroyed in a bombing run over Paris. He heard one of MacArthur's generals had taken it as a spoil of war, and many other unbelievable things. After the war, it was supposed to have been taken to Jordan, then to Egypt, to Russia, to South Africa, and finally back to Europe. But he never could substantiate these things. And all the while, Charles grew older, less sturdy, but he never died. He was over 100 years old now, 106 to be precise, but he could pass for a robust 50 most of the time. He had buried his wife, all 3 of his children, 2 of his grandchildren as well. He'd lost his youngest son to Vietnam and his oldest grandson to the Iraq War. He was trying to keep his great-grandson from enlisting. They all seemed to want to follow in his footsteps, but they couldn't grasp that he had not done this for his country. "Checkmate," he spat viciously as he conquered his old rival. He had gone to war not for his wife or the baby in her arms, or even for the one holding her hand. He had gone to war for this metal monstrosity and the evil prophecy that it held. "Well played," it intoned, and he hated the sense of pride that filled him at those words. "You may ask one question, any question, and I will answer it for you. You have defeated the great Gizmo, and now the secrets of the universe are open to you." Some men would have taken this chance to learn the nature of time, the identity of God, maybe even the night's lotto numbers, but there was only one question that interested Charles. "How much longer will I live?" The great Gizmo sat back a little, seeming to contemplate the question. "You will live for as long as there is a great Gizmo. Our lives are connected by fate, and we shall exist together until we do not." Charles thought about that for a long time, though he supposed he had known all along what the answer would be. The man behind the counter looked startled when the old man approached him and asked to buy the great Gizmo. "That old thing?" he asked, not quite believing it. "It's an antique, buddy. I picked it up in Maine, hoping it would draw in some extra customers, but it never did. Thing creeps people out." "It creeps me out, too, if I'm being honest. I guess I'd sell it to you for $1,500. That's what I paid for it, and I'd like to get at least what I paid back for the damn thing." Charles brought out a money clip and peeled $200 bills from it. He handed them to the man, saying he would have men here to collect it within the hour. "Hey, pal, you paid me too much. I only wanted—" "The rest is a bonus for finding something I've searched for my whole life." He called the men he had hired to move the thing and stayed there until they had it secured on the truck. Charles had a spot at the house for it, a room of other treasures that he had found while looking for the old golem. The walls were fire retardant, the floor was concrete, the ceiling was perfectly set to never fall or shift. Charles had been keeping a spot for the great Gizmo for years, and now he would keep him and himself for as long as forever would last. Or at least, he reflected, for 4 more chess matches. Wasn't that what the great Gizmo had promised him, after all?